Section 33 of the Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 14, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. The Reign of Terror, A.D. 1794, by Francois P.G. Guizot, Part 2. Jddykst had just entered. He had not appeared at the Committee of Public Safety. "You have blighted my heart," he wrote to his colleagues. "I am about to open it at the National Assembly." He presented himself, however, as reporter of the committee, and seeing him pass, Tallien, occupied in assembling his forces, said loudly, "It is the moment, let us enter." Jddykst commenced. "I am not of any faction. I fight against all. The course of events has brought it about that this tribune should be perhaps the Tarpeian rock to him who shall come to tell you that the members of the government—" Tallien did not leave him time to finish. He demanded leave to speak upon a motion of order. "Nor I either. I am not of any faction. I only belong to myself and to liberty. It is I who will make you hear the truth. No good citizen can restrain his tears over the unfortunate condition of public affairs. Yesterday a member of the government was here alone and denounced his colleagues. Today another comes to do as much by him. These dissensions aggravate the evils of our country. I demand that the veil be torn away." Applause echoed from all parts of the hall. Jddykst wished to continue his speech. "Thou art not reporter," shouted the members. He remained motionless in the tribune, while Beloud Varian came and stood beside him. He cast his eyes over the hall. "I see here," said he, "one of the men who yesterday at the Jacobians promised the massacre of the National Convention. Let him be arrested." The officers obeyed. "The Assembly is at the present time in danger of massacre on every hand," continued Beloud. "It will perish if it is feeble." The contagion of courage spread from man to man. All the deputies stood up waving their hats. "Be tranquil," they cried to the orator. "We will not give way." "You will tremble when you see in what hands you are," continued Beloud. "The armed force is confided to parasitical hands. The chief of the National Guard is an infamous conspirator, the accomplice of Herbert. Lafayette was a noble driven out of the army of the North and saved by Robespierre, whom he obeys. The revolutionary tribunal is in his hands. Everywhere he has made his will supreme and has sought to render himself absolute master. He has dismissed the best revolutionary committee of Paris. He has ceased to frequent the Committee of Public Safety since the day after the decree of the 22nd Parail, which has been so disastrous to patriots. He excites the Jacobians against the Assembly." A few feeble protestations were now heard. "There is some murmuring, I think," said the speaker insolently. He was about to continue the course of his accusations, but beside him in the tribune Robespierre had replaced Jddykst. His natural pallor had become livid, rage sparkled in his glance. "I demand liberty to speak," he cried. A single shout echoed through the hall. "Down with the tyrant! Down with the tyrant!" "I demand liberty to speak," Robespierre violently repeated. Tallien dashed into the tribune. "I demand that the veil be torn away immediately," he cried. "The work is accomplished. The conspirators are unmasked. Yesterday at the Jacobians I saw the army of New Cromwell formed, and I have come here armed with a poignard to pierce his heart if the Assembly has not the courage to decree his accusation. I demand the arrest of Henry and his staff. There will be no May 31st, no proscription. National justice alone will strike the miscreants." "I demand that Dumas be arrested," added Beloud Varian, "as well as Bollinger, formerly lieutenant of Ronsin in the Vendée. He was the most ardent yesterday night at the Jacobians." Meanwhile Robespierre was still in the tribune. Several times he strove to begin speaking, but the same cry drowned his voice. "Down with the tyrant!" The little group of those who were faithful to him, close pressed together, followed him with their eyes without speaking, without seconding his efforts. The mass of the Assembly, so docile a few days before, was agitated with a violence that became more and more hostile. Barrier hesitated no longer. It is said that he had prepared two statements, one favorable to and the other hostile to Robespierre. He proposed to abolish the grade of Commandant General and to call the bar of the Mayor Fleurot and the National Agent Payan to answer there for public tranquillity. The decree was voted. On all sides arose accusations against Robespierre, everyone hastening to denounce him. "I demand liberty to speak, to bring back this discussion to its true end and aim," said Tallien. Robespierre raised his head. I shall know well how to bring it there, said he in those imperious accents which formerly cowed the assembly. Tallien continued without noticing the interruption. The conspiracy is quite complete in the discourse read and reread yesterday. It is there that I find arms to strike down this man whose virtue and patriotism have been so much vaunted, this man who appeared 3 days only after August 10th, this man who has abandoned his post at the Committee of Public Safety in order to come and calumniate his colleagues. It is not necessary to discuss in any particular detail of the tyrant's career. His whole life condemns him. Robespierre clutched at the tribune with both hands. He no longer sought aid from the mountain, henceforth roused against him. He turned his face towards the plain. It is to you, pure and virtuous men, that I address myself. I don't talk with scoundrels. Down with the tyrant, responded the plain. Thoreau, who presided, rang his bell. President of Assassins, cried Robespierre, yet once more I demand liberty to speak. His voice grew feebler. The blood of Danton is choking him, cried Gamier de Lerode. Will this man long remain master of the Convention? Asked Charles Duval. Let us make an end. A decree, shouted Lassault at length. A tyrant is hard to strike down, said Fréon in a loud voice. Robespierre remained in the tribune, turning in his hands an open knife. Alone, exposed to the vengeful anger of them all. Send me to death, he cried to his enemies, and the voices replied, Thou hast merited it 1,000 times. Down with the tyrant. The decree was voted in the midst of tumult. I asked to share the lot of my brother, cried the younger Robespierre. It is understood, said Lachey, that we have voted the arrest of the 2 Robespierres of Couthon and Saint-Just. I asked to be comprised in the decree, protested Lebas, faithfully devoted to Saint-Just. The triumvirate of Robespierre, Couthon, and Saint-Just, said Ferron, recalls the proscriptions of Sylla. Couthon is a tiger thirsting for the blood of the national representatives. He has dared to speak at the Jacobians of 5 or 6 heads of the Convention. Our corpses were to be the steps for him to mount the throne. The paralytic made a gesture of bitter disdain. I mount the throne, said he. Thurot proclaimed the decree. The acclamations that re-echoed were furious, intoxicated with the joy of triumph. Long live liberty! Long live the Republic! Down with the tyrants! To the bar with the accused! The officers, still bewildered with such an abrupt and sudden change, had not dared to lay a hand upon the fallen dictator. Rage broke forth in the ranks of the assembly. Robespierre and his brother, Saint-Just, Lebas, descended slowly to the place lately reserved for their enemies. Couthon had just placed himself there. The decree of arrest dispersed them in different prisons. They had set out when the assembly suspended its sitting for an instant. Let us go out together, said Robespierre. The crowd, like the assembly, gazed on them without acclamations and without manifesting any sympathy for them. Their army was reforming elsewhere. The Commune of Paris and the Club of the Jacobians had not laid down their arms. An officer was sent to the Hôtel des Villes to announce the decree, which dismissed Henriot and summoned the mayor to appear at the bar. He naively demanded a receipt for his message. On a day like this, we don't give receipts, replied the mayor. Tell Robespierre to have no fear, for we are here. The Commune, in fact, was active while the committees of the Convention, stupefied at their own victories, were letting precious time slip past. Already Henriot, half drunk, galloping across the streets, stirred up the people, crying out that their faithful representatives were being massacred, delivering over to insult Merlin de Thionville, and sending to death the convoy of victims for the day. These the inhabitants of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine set about delivering from compassion and from a vague instinct that the arrest of Robespierre necessarily brought about a cessation of executions. The General Council had sent to the jailers of the prisons an order to refuse to aid in the incarceration of the accused. Robespierre and his friends were successfully brought to the Mairie. They found themselves again free at the head of an insurrection precipitately got up, but directed by desperate men who felt their lives in danger if power escaped from them. Henriot, arrested for a moment and conducted to the Committee of General Security, had been delivered by Coffin Hall at the head of a handful of men. He was again on horseback and was menacing in the hall of their sittings the assembly, which had again come together. The tocsin rang forth a full peal. The gates of Paris were closed. The rising tumult of the insurrection reached the ears of the deputies. Each minute some inauspicious news arrived. It was said that the gunners of the National Guard, seduced by Henriot, were coming to direct their artillery against the palace. Collet de Herbois mounted slowly to the chair and seated himself there. "Representatives," said he with a firm voice, "the moment has come for us to die at our post. Miscreants have invaded the National Palace." All had taken their places, while the spectators fled from the galleries with uproar and confusion. "I propose," said Eli Lacoste with a loud voice, "that Henrot be outlawed." At the same moment the dismissed commandant ordered his men to fire. Fearful and troubled, the gunners still hesitated. A group of representatives went forth from the hall and cried, "What are you doing, soldiers? That man is a rebel who has just been outlawed." The gunners had already lowered their matches while Henrot fled at full gallop. Barras had just been named commandant of the forces. In his place 7 representatives accompanied him. "Outlaw all those who shall take arms against the convention or who shall oppose its decrees," said Barrier, "as well as those who are eluding a decree of accusation or arrest." The decree was voted. An officer of the convention boldly accepted the duty of bearing it to the commune. The national agent, Payan, seized it from him, and for bravado read it with a loud voice before the crowd that was thronging in the hall of the Hôtel de Ville. He added these words which were not in the decree, "and all those found at this moment in the galleries." The spectators disappeared as if struck with terror at the name of the law. Times were changed. The mobile waves of public opinion no longer upheld the tyrants overthrown by the accomplices who had now become their enemies. It was, without saying it, and possibly without knowing it, the feeling of this public abandonment and reprobation which paralyzed the energy of the 5 accused. Robespierre had arrived pale and trembling in all his limbs. He had been tranquilized with difficulty. When Couthon, who alone was retained for a time in the prison of Labour, was at last brought to the Hôtel de Ville, he found the council solely occupied with the attack on the Convention, without making any efforts for rousing the populace or for the vigorous resumption of power. "Have the armies been written to?" he asked. "In the name of whom?" said Robespierre, disheartened but calm. "Of the Convention which exists wherever we are. The rest are but a handful of facetious men, who are about to be dispersed by armed force." Robespierre reflected. He shook his head. "We must write in the name of the French people," said he. The words "au nom des peuples" were found in his handwriting on a sheet of paper. It was also in the name of the people that Barras and his companions reunited the battalions of the sections which slowly assembled. Some had recalled their men from the Hôtel de Ville. The new military school, the École des Mères, had not appeared well disposed towards Libas, who had written to the commandant Lebracte to hinder his pupils from ranging themselves under the banners of the Convention. The young men marched willingly at the request of Barras. The gunners collected on the Place de Grève permitted Leonard Bourdon to approach. "Go," said Tallien to him, "and let the sun when it rises find no more traitors living." The crowd dispersed on hearing the proclamation which outlawed the Commune of Paris. The gunners abandoned their pieces. A few hours later they came to seek them to protect the Convention. "Is it possible," cried Henrot, as he came forth from the Hôtel de Ville, "that those scoundrels of gunners have abandoned me? Presently they will be delivering me to the Tuileries." He ran to announce the desertion to the assembled Council General. Coffin Hall, indignant at his cowardice, seized him by the shoulder and pushed him out by the window. The agents of the police arrested him in a sewer. Meanwhile, the section of the Gravilliers had put itself in marching order, commanded by Leonard Bourdon and by a gendarme named Maida, intelligent and devoted, and who had acquired an ascendancy over those around him. He advanced towards the Hôtel de Ville without encountering any obstacle. Maida cried, in mounting the flight of steps, "Long live Robespierre!" He penetrated into the hall, obstructed by the crowd. The club of the Jacobians was deserted. Legendre had the door closed. All the leaders of the revolution were assembled round the proscribed representatives. They were discussing and vociferating without order, however, and without any true hope. Robespierre was seated at a table, his head on his left hand, his elbow supported by his knee. Maida advanced towards him, pistols in hand. "Surrender, traitor!" he cried. Robespierre raised his head. "It is thou who art a traitor," he said, "and I will have thee shot." At the same instant the gendarme fired, fracturing the lower jaw of Robespierre. As he fell, his brother opened the window and, passing along the cornice, leaped out upon the place. He was dying when they came to pick him up. Saint-Just, leaning over toward Labas, said, "Kill me." Labas, looking him in the face, replied, "I have something better to do," pressing the trigger of his pistol. He was dead when a fresh report resounded from the staircase. Maida, who pursued Henrot, had just drawn on Couthon. His bearer fell grievously wounded. The prisoners, formerly all-powerful, now dying or condemned, were collected in the same room. Thither Robespierre and Couthon had been brought. The corpse of Labas lay on the floor. The crowd who besieged the gates wanted to throw the wounded into the river. Couthon had great difficulty in making it understood that he was not dead. Robespierre could not speak and was carried on a chair to the door of the convention. A feeling of horror manifested itself in the assembly. "No, not here, not here," was the cry. A surgeon came to attend to the wounded man in the hall of the Committee of Public Safety. He recovered from his swoon and walked alone toward his chair. Until then he had been extended upon a table, a little deal box supporting his wounded head. The blood flowed slowly from his mouth, and at times he made a movement to wipe it away. His clothes and his face were smeared with it. Robespierre appeared insensible to the injuries of those who surrounded him. He made no complaint, inaccessible and alone in death as in life. They carried him to the concierge, where Saint-Just and Couthon had just arrived. All had been outlawed. No procedure, no delay, retarded their execution. Saint-Just, looking at a table of the Rights of Man hanging in the hall, said, "It is I, however, who have done that." The concierge slowly filled with Dumas, Fleurot, Payan, Lafayette. A large proportion of the members of the Council General had been arrested. The prisoners already retained here were pressing to the bars of their windows, curious as to the noise that reached their ears, and the vague rumors which had already excited mortal fears among the informers. Before the room, where were imprisoned Madame de Beauharnais and Madame de Fontenay, afterward Madame Tallien, a woman appeared who, in a marked manner, held up a stone, Pierre, enveloped it in her dress, robe, and then made a gesture of beheading. The prisoners comprehended. A thrill of joy pervaded their gloomy abode. All the oppressed believed themselves already delivered. It was 5 o'clock, and the carts had just drawn up as usual at the gate of the prison, but this time they waited for the executioners. The procession defiled before a dense crowd. All the windows were full of spectators, all the shops were open, and joy sparkled in every countenance. Robespierre and his friends had wearied with executions the people of Paris. The sanguinary emotions to which they had been so long accustomed regained their first relish. It was Robespierre that they were about to see die. He was half stretched out in the cart, livid and with a blood-stained cloth round his face. When the executioner snatched it from him on the scaffold, a terrible cry was heard, the first sign of suffering the condemned had given. To this shriek, cries of joy responded from all around, which were repeated at each stroke from the fatal axe. In 2 days, 103 executions violently sealed the vengeance of the Convocation. The justice of God and that of history bide their time. Robespierre had successfully vanquished all his enemies, clever and bold, protected and served by his reputation for virtue, seconded by the growing terror which his name inspired. He had usurped the entire power and confiscated the revolution for the profit of despotism. He succumbed under the blows of those who had constantly pushed him to the front, wearied or frightened by the tyranny whose vengeance they themselves dreaded. The hands which overthrew the terrible dictator were not pure hands, and revolutionary passions continued to animate many minds, but the public instincts did not err for an instant. The conquerors of the 9th Thermidor could in their turn seize upon power, and the greater number of them had had no other intention, but they might no longer spill blood at their pleasure, without hindrance and without control. The culminating point of sufferings and crimes had been attained. Without wishing it and without knowing it, from envy or from fear, the Thermidorians, as they began to be called, in striking down the triumvirate, had changed the course of the revolution. The nation, always prompt to concentrate upon the name of one man, its affections or its hatreds, panting and lacerated as it was, began to breathe. The prisoners ceased to expect death daily. Their friends already hoped for their liberty. Timid people ventured forth from their hiding places. The bold loudly manifested their joy. People dared to wear mourning for those who had died on the scaffold. Widows came forth from houses in which they had kept themselves shut up. Absent ones reappeared in the bosom of their families. Robespierre was no more. The convention had revolted almost unanimously against the tyrant. Scarcely was he struck down when it found itself again a prey to divisions. Public demonstrations of joy and relief were manifested everywhere, and this disquieted some of the leaders of the conspiracy formerly directed against Robespierre. They had thought to overthrow him in order themselves to occupy his place, and already they perceived that 2 tendencies were manifesting themselves in the country. The one, feeble as yet in the convention, and with no other point of support than the remnant of the right, disposed to retrace the course of events, and even to visit upon the authors the iniquities committed. The other, disquieted and gloomy, determined to defend the revolution at any hazard, even though it might be at the price of new sacrifices. The small party of the Thermidorians, Tallien at their head, began to form themselves between these 2 irreconcilable parties. The reaction as yet bore no definite name. It did not and could not exercise any power. Desired or dreaded, it was at the bottom of every thought. It influenced all decisions, often rendering them apparently contrary. The terrible glory of Robespierre and the crushing weight that rests upon its memory are due to the sudden transformation effected by his death. In outward semblance, and for some time longer, the customary terms were employed, but the character of the situation was radically changed. End of section 33.
Section 34 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Piotr. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 14. Edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. The Downfall of Poland, A.D. 1794, by Sir Archibald Alison. That the French Revolution was not more actively interfered with by the powers of Eastern Europe was largely due to the fact that they were all busy with a spoliation of their own. When Kosciuszko, the great Polish patriot and hero, failed in his endeavour to rescue his country from foreign thraldom, the doom of the ancient kingdom was sealed. In the following year, 1795, the third and final partition of Poland, between Russia, Austria, and Prussia, was made. This destruction of a heroic nationality was bewailed by the friends of liberty throughout the world, and it was told in passionate regret how freedom shrieked as Kosciuszko fell. Although brave and liberty-loving, the people of Poland had not kept pace with political progress among the more advanced nations. In the 14th century, Poland had risen to her greatest power. Her political character from ancient days was peculiar, being at once monarchical and republican. But she had a feudalism of her own, which survived long after European feudal system was outgrown by other nations. Her political system was cumbrous and lacking in unity. The first partition by the powers above named, in 1772, left her in still worse disorder. A new constitution proved unsatisfactory, one party favouring it, another seeking to overthrow it. Russian interference was invoked. The Polish patriots resisted, but in 1792 they were defeated, and Russia, with Prussia, made the second partition of Poland in 1793. In 1794 Kosciuszko was made commander-in-chief and dictator of Poland. The insurrection began with the murder of the Russians in Warsaw, but the Poles suffered from their own dissensions as before, and met with the disaster that led to their national extinction. There is a certain degree of calamity which overwhelms the courage, but there is another which, by reducing men to desperation, sometimes leads to the greatest and most glorious enterprises. To this latter state the Poles were now reduced, abandoned by all the world, distracted with internal divisions, destitute alike of fortresses and resources, crushed in the grasp of gigantic enemies. The patriots of that unhappy country, consulting only their own courage, resolved to make a last effort to deliver it from its enemies. In the midst of their internal convulsions, and through all the prostration of their national strength, the Poles had never lost their individual courage, or the ennobling feeling of civil independence. They were still the redoubtable hussars who broke the Mussulman ranks under the walls of Vienna, and carried the Polish eagles in triumph to the towers of the Kremlin, whose national cry had so often made the Osmanlis tremble, and who had boasted in their hours of triumph that if the heaven itself were to fall, they would support it on the points of their lances. A band of patriots at Warsaw resolved at all hazards to attempt the restoration of their independence, and they made choice of Kosciuszko, who was then at Leipzig, to direct their efforts. This illustrious hero, who had received the rudiments of military education in France, had afterwards served, not without glory, in the War of Independence in America. Uniting to Polish enthusiasm, French ability, the ardent friend of liberty, and the enlightened advocate for order, brave, loyal, and generous, he was in every way qualified to head the last struggle of the oldest republic in existence for its national independence, but a nearer approach to the scene of danger convinced him that the hour for action had not yet arrived. The passions indeed were awakened, the national enthusiasm was full, but the means of resistance were inconsiderable, and the old divisions of the republic were not so healed as to afford the prospect of the whole national strength being exerted in its defence. But the public indignation could brook no delay. Several regiments stationed at Półtusk revolted and moved toward Galicia, and Kosciuszko, albeit despairing of success, determined not to be absent in the hour of danger, hastened to Cracow, where on March 3rd he closed the gates and proclaimed the insurrection. Having, by means of the regiments which had revolted and the junction of some bodies of armed peasants, imperfectly armed indeed but full of enthusiasm, collected a force of 5,000 men, Kosciuszko left Cracow and boldly advanced into the open country. He encountered a body of 3,000 Russians at Racławice, and after an obstinate engagement succeeded in routing it with great slaughter. This action, inconsiderable in itself, had important consequences. The Polish peasants exchanged their scythes for the arms found on the field of battle, and the insurrection, encouraged by this first gleam of success, soon communicated itself to the adjoining provinces. In vain Stanislaus disavowed the acts of his subjects. The flame of independence spread with the rapidity of lightning, and soon all the freemen in Poland were in arms. Warsaw was the first great point where the flame broke out. The intelligence of the success at Racławice was received there on April 12th and occasioned the most violent agitation. For some days afterward it was evident that an explosion was at hand, and at length at daybreak on the morning of the 17th the brigade of Polish Guards, under the direction of their officers, attacked the governor's house and the arsenal, and was speedily joined by the populace. The Russian and Prussian troops in the neighbourhood of the capital were about 7,000 men, and after a prolonged and obstinate contest in the streets for 36 hours they were driven across the Vistula with the loss of above 3,000 men in killed and prisoners, and the flag of independence was hoisted on the towers of Warsaw. One of the most embarrassing circumstances in the situation of the Russians was the presence of above 16,000 Poles in their ranks, who were known to sympathize strongly with these heroic efforts of their fellow citizens. Orders were immediately dispatched to Suvorov to assemble a corps and disarm the Polish troops scattered in Podolia before they could unite in any common measure for their defence. By the energy and activity of this great commander, the Poles were disarmed, brigade after brigade, and above 12,000 men reduced to a state of inaction without much difficulty. A most important operation, not only by destroying the nucleus of a powerful army, but by stifling the commencement of the insurrection in Volhynia and Podolia. How different might have been the fate of Poland and Europe had they been enabled to join the ranks of their countrymen. Kosciuszko and his countrymen did everything that courage or energy could suggest to put on foot a formidable force to resist their adversaries. A provisional government was established, and in a short time a force of 40,000 men was raised. But this force, though highly honourable to the patriotism of the Poles, was inconsiderable when compared with the vast armies which Russia and Prussia could bring up for their subjugation. Small as the army was, its maintenance was too great an effort for the resources of the kingdom, which, torn by intestine factions, without commerce, harbours, or manufactures, having no national credit and no industrious class of citizens but the Jews, now felt the fatal effects of its long career of democratic anarchy. The population of the country, composed entirely of unruly gentlemen and ignorant serfs, was totally unable at that time to furnish those numerous supplies of intelligent officers which are requisite for the formation of an efficient military force, while the nobility, however formidable on horseback in the Hungarian or Turkish wars, were less to be relied on in a contest with regular troops, where infantry and artillery constituted the great strength of the army, and courage was unavailing without the aid of science and military discipline. The central position of Poland in the midst of its enemies would have afforded great military advantages had its inhabitants possessed a force capable of turning it to account, that is, if they had had, like Frederick the Great in the 7 Years' War, 150,000 regular troops, which the population of the country could easily have maintained, and a few well-fortified towns to arrest the enemy in one quarter, while the bulk of the national force was precipitated upon them in another. The glorious stand made by the nation in 1831, with only 30,000 regular soldiers at the commencement of the insurrection, and no fortifications but those of Warsaw and Modlin, proves what immense advantages this central position affords, and what opportunities it offers to military genius like that of Skrzynecki to inflict the most severe wounds even on a superior and well-conducted antagonist. But all these advantages were wanting to Kosciuszko, and it augments our admiration of his talents and of the heroism of his countrymen, that with such inconsiderable means they made so honourable a stand for their national independence. No sooner was the King of Prussia informed of the revolution at Warsaw than he moved forward at the head of 30,000 men to besiege that city, while Suvorov, with 40,000 veterans, was preparing to enter the southeastern parts of the kingdom. Aware of the necessity of striking a blow before the enemy's forces were united, Kosciuszko advanced with 12,000 men to attack the Russian general, Denisov, but upon approaching his corps he discovered that it had united to the army commanded by the king in person. Unable to face such superior forces, he immediately retired, but was attacked next morning at daybreak near Szczekociny by the allies, and after a gallant resistance his army was routed, and Cracow fell into the hands of the conquerors. This check was the more severely felt, as about the same time General Zajączek was defeated at Chełm and obliged to recross the Vistula, leaving the whole country on the right bank of that river in the hands of the Russians. These disasters produced a great impression at Warsaw. The people, as usual, ascribed them to treachery, and insisted that the leaders should be brought to punishment, and although the chiefs escaped, several persons in an inferior situation were arrested and thrown into prison. Apprehensive of some subterfuge, if the accused were regularly brought to trial, the burghers assembled in tumultuous bodies, forced the prisons, erected scaffolds in the streets, and after the manner of the assassins of September 2nd, put above 12 persons to death with their own hands. These excesses affected with the most profound grief the pure heart of Kosciuszko. He flew to the capital, restored order, and delivered over to punishment the leaders of the revolt. But the resources of the country were evidently unequal to the struggle. The paper money, which had been issued in their extremity, was at a frightful discount, and the sacrifices required of the nation were, on that account, the more severely felt, so that hardly a hope of ultimate success remained. The combined Russian and Prussian armies, about 35,000 strong, now advanced against the capital, where Kosciuszko occupied an entrenched camp with 25,000 men. During the whole of July and August the besiegers were engaged in fruitless attempts to drive the Poles into the city, and at length a great convoy with artillery and stores for a regular siege, which was ascending the Vistula, having been captured by a gentleman named Minewski at the head of a body of peasants, the King of Prussia raised the siege, leaving a portion of his sick and stores in the hands of the patriots. After this success the insurrection spread immensely, and the Poles mustered nearly 80,000 men under arms. But they were scattered over too extensive a line of country in order to make head against their numerous enemies, a policy tempting by the prospect it holds forth of exciting the intensive insurrection, but ruinous in the end by exposing the patriotic forces to the risk of being beaten in detail. Scarcely had the Poles recovered from their intoxication at the raising of the siege of Warsaw, when intelligence was received of the defeat of Sierawski, who commanded a corps of 10,000 men beyond the Bug by the Russian Grand Army under Suvorov. This celebrated general, to whom the principal conduct of the war was now committed, followed up his successes with the utmost vigour. The retreating column was again assailed on the 19th by the victorious Russians, and after a glorious resistance, driven into the woods between Janów and Biała, with the loss of 4,000 men and 28 pieces of cannon. Scarcely 3,000 Poles, with Sierawski at their head, escaped into Siedlce. Upon receiving the accounts of this disaster, Kościuszko resolved, by drawing together all his detachments, to fall upon Fersen before he joined Suvorov and the other corps which were advancing against the capital. With this view he ordered General Poniński to join him, and marched with all his disposable forces to attack the Russian general, who was stationed at Maciejowice. But fortune on this occasion cruelly deceived the Poles. Arrived in the neighbourhood of Fersen's position, he found that Poniński had not yet come up, and the Russian commander, overjoyed at this circumstance, resolved immediately to attack him. In vain Kościuszko dispatched courier after courier to Poniński to advance to his relief. The first was intercepted by the Cossacks, and the second did not reach that leader in time to enable him to take a decisive part in the approaching combat. Nevertheless, the Polish commander, aware of the danger of retreating with inexperienced troops in presence of a disciplined and superior enemy, determined to give battle on the following day, and drew up his little army with as much skill as the circumstances would admit. The forces on the opposite side in this action, which decided the fate of Poland, were nearly equal in point of numbers, but the advantages of discipline and equipment were decisively on the side of the Russians. Kościuszko commanded about 10,000 men, a part of whom were recently raised and imperfectly disciplined, while Fersen was at the head of 12,000 veterans, including a most formidable body of cavalry. Nevertheless, the Poles in the centre and right wing made a glorious defence, but the left, which Poniński should have supported, having been overwhelmed by the cavalry under Denisov, the whole army was, after severe struggle, thrown into confusion. Kościuszko, Sierawski, and other gallant chiefs in vain made the most heroic efforts to rally the broken troops. They were wounded, struck down, and made prisoners by the Cossacks, who swarmed over the field of battle, while the remains of the army, now reduced to 7,000 men, fell back in confusion toward Warsaw. After the fall of Kościuszko, who sustained in his single person the fortunes of the Republic, nothing but a series of disasters overtook the Poles. The Austrians, taking advantage of the general confusion, entered Galicia and occupied the Palatinates of Lublin and Sandomir, while Suvorov, pressing forward toward the capital, defeated Mokronovski, who, at the head of 12,000 men, strove to retard the advance of that redoubtable commander. In vain the Poles made the utmost efforts. They were routed with the loss of 4,000 men, and the patriots, though now despairing of success, resolved to sell their lives dearly, and shut themselves up in Warsaw to await the approach of the conqueror. Suvorov was soon at the gates of Praga, the eastern suburb of that capital, where 26,000 men and 100 pieces of cannon defended the bridge of the Vistula and the approach to the capital. To assault such a position with forces hardly superior was evidently a hazardous enterprise, but the approach of winter rendering it indispensable that if anything was done at all it should be immediately attempted, Suvorov, who was habituated to successful assaults in the Turkish wars, resolved to storm the city. On November 2nd the Russians made their appearance before the glacis of Praga, and Suvorov, having in great haste completed 3 powerful batteries and breached the defences with imposing celerity, made his dispositions for a general assault on the following day. The conquerors of Ismail advanced to the attack in the same order which they had adopted on that memorable occasion. 7 columns at daybreak approached the ramparts, rapidly filled up the ditches with their fascines, broke down the defences, and pouring into the entrenched camp, carried destruction into the ranks of the Poles. In vain the defenders did their utmost to resist the torrent. The wooden houses of Praga speedily took fire, and amid the shouts of the victors and the cries of the inhabitants, the Polish battalions were borne backward to the edge of the Vistula. The multitude of fugitives speedily broke down the bridges, and the citizens of Warsaw beheld with unavailing anguish their defenders on the other side perishing in the flames, or by the sword of the conquerors. 10,000 soldiers fell on the spot, 9,000 were made prisoners, and above 12,000 citizens of every age and sex were put to the sword, a dreadful instance of carnage which has left a lasting stain on the name of Suvorov, and which Russia expiated in the conflagration of Moscow. The tragedy was at the end. Warsaw capitulated 2 days afterwards. The detached parties of the patriots melted away, and Poland was no more. On November the 6th, Suvorov made his triumphant entry into the blood-stained capital. King Stanislaus was sent into Russia, where he ended his days in captivity, and the final partition of the monarchy was effected. End of section 34.
Section 35 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Beeswaxcandle. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 14. Edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. The Rise of Napoleon. The French Conquest of Italy, AD 1796, by Sir Walter Scott. Napoleon, regarded by many as the most remarkable man of modern times, took control of the forces of the French Revolution and directed them toward purposes little dreamed of by the earlier leaders of the uprising. The excesses of the Reign of Terror had caused such a reaction that even in Paris men began to talk of restoring the monarchy, and in 1795 a new tumult began, due in part to the efforts of the Royalists. Once more a mob marched against the hall of the National Convention, and the general of the national troops in the city, uncertain what to do, gladly left affairs in the hands of a subordinate, one of the few remaining French officers who had received a regular military training under the old regime. This lesser general, a young man of 26, was Napoleon Bonaparte, who had already won repute as a military engineer. Bonaparte met the mob as no Paris mob had yet been met. He had a row of cannon loaded with grape shot, and these were fired to kill. Many of the rabble fell, the rest fled in dismay. "That whiff of grape shot," says Carlyle, "ended the revolution." Bonaparte, made much of by the convention he had defended, was appointed commander of the army fighting on the Italian frontier. Ever since Valmy, revolutionary France had been compelled to defend herself against civil war within and the attacks of the foreign monarchs, friends and relatives of Louis XVI from without. The tremendous energy of her aroused people had made her equal to the task. She had conquered Holland and the German lands west of the Rhine. She had forced both Prussia and Spain to sue for peace. But England from her island throne, and Austria, the most powerful of France's continental foes, the most closely related to the murdered Queen Marie Antoinette, was still threatening the French borders. The Austrians held most of Italy, and it was against them that Napoleon was dispatched. He was the first to carry the war away from the French borderline and into the heart of the countries of her foes. France was starving, and Napoleon from the treasuries of Italy sent her unlimited supplies, sent her splendid works of art. No wonder the impoverished people hailed him with delight as their preserver. No wonder the purer aspirations after liberty perished in the passion for conquest, spoils, and that Frenchest of French vanities, la gloire. Napoleon has himself observed that no country in the world is more distinctly marked out by its natural boundaries than Italy. The Alps seem a barrier erected by nature herself, on which she has inscribed in gigantic characters, "Here let ambition be stayed." Yet this tremendous circumvallation of mountains, as it could not prevent the ancient Romans from breaking out to desolate the world, so it has been in like manner found, ever since the days of Hannibal, unequal to protect Italy herself from invasion. The French nation, in the times of which we treat, spoke indeed of the Alps as a natural boundary, so far as to authorise them to claim all which lay on the western side of these mountains as naturally pertaining to their dominions. But they never deigned to respect them as such when the question respected their invading on their own part the territories of other states which lay on or beyond the formidable frontier. They assumed the law of natural limits as an unchallengeable rule when it was made in favour of France, but never allowed it to be quoted against her interest. During the Revolutionary War, the general fortune of battle had varied from time to time in the neighbourhood of these mighty boundaries. The King of Sardinia possessed almost all the fortresses which command the passes on these mountains, and had therefore been said to wear the keys of the Alps at his girdle. He had indeed lost his dukedom of Savoy and the county of Nice in the last campaign, but he still maintained in opposition to the French a very considerable army, and was supported by his powerful ally, the Emperor of Austria, always vigilant regarding that rich and beautiful portion of his dominions which lies in the north of Italy. The frontiers of Piedmont were therefore covered by a strong Austro-Sardinian army, opposed to the French armies to which Napoleon had just been named commander-in-chief. A strong Neapolitan force was also to be added, so that in general numbers their opponents were much superior to the French, but a great part of this force was cooped up in garrisons which could not be abandoned. It may be imagined with what delight the general, scarce aged 26, advanced to an independent field of glory and conquest, confident in his own powers, and in the perfect knowledge of the country which he had acquired, when, by his scientific plans of the campaign, he had enabled General de Maubion to drive the Austrians back, and obtain possession of the Col de Tende, Saorgio, and the gorges of the higher Alps. Bonaparte's achievements had hitherto been under the auspices of others. He made the dispositions before Toulon, but it was Dugommier who had the credit of taking the place. De Maubion, as we have just said, obtained the merit of the advantages in Piedmont. Even in the civil turmoil of the 13th Vendémiaire, his actual services had been overshadowed by the official dignity of Barras as commander-in-chief. But if he reaped honour in Italy, the success would be exclusively his own, and that proud heart must have throbbed to meet danger upon such terms, that keen spirit to have toiled to discover the means of success. For victory he relied chiefly upon a system of tactics hitherto unpractised in war, or at least upon any considerable or uniform scale. As war becomes a profession and a subject of deep study, it is gradually discovered that the principles of tactics depend upon mathematical and arithmetical science, and that the commander will be victorious who can assemble the greatest number of forces upon the same point at the same moment, notwithstanding an inferiority of numbers to the enemy when the general force is computed on both sides. No man ever possessed in a greater degree than Bonaparte the power of calculation and combination necessary for directing such decisive manoeuvres. It constituted indeed his secret, as it was for some time called, and that secret consisted in an imagination fertile in expedients which would never have occurred to others, clearness and precision in forming his plans, a mode of directing with certainty the separate moving columns which were to execute them, by arranging so that each division should arrive on the destined position at the exact time when their service was necessary, and above all, in the knowledge which enabled such a master spirit to choose the most fitting subordinate implements, to attach them to his person, and by explaining to them so much of his plan as was necessary each should execute, to secure the exertion of their utmost ability in carrying it into effect. Thus, not only were his manoeuvres, however daring, executed with a precision which warlike operations had not attained before his time, but they were also performed with a celerity which gave them almost the effect of surprise. Napoleon was like lightning in the eyes of his enemies, and when repeated experience had taught them to expect this portentous rapidity of movement, it sometimes induced his opponents to wait in a dubious and hesitating posture for attacks which, with less apprehension of their antagonist, they would have thought it more prudent to frustrate and to anticipate. The forces which Bonaparte had under his command were between 50 and 60,000 good troops, having, many of them, been brought from the Spanish campaign in consequence of the peace with that country, but very indifferently provided with clothing and suffering from the hardships they had endured in those mountains, barren and cold regions. The cavalry, in particular, were in very poor order, but the nature of their new field of action not admitting of their being much employed, rendered this of less consequence. The misery of the French army, until these Alpine campaigns were victoriously closed by the armistice of Cherasco, could, according to Bonaparte's authority, scarce bear description. The officers, for several years, had received no more than 8 livres a month, 20 pence sterling a week, in name of pay, and staff officers had not among them a single horse. Berthier preserved, as a curiosity, an order dated on the day of the victory of Albaigne, which munificently conferred a gratuity of 3 louis d'or upon every general of division. Among the generals to whom this donation was rendered acceptable by their wants were, or might have been, many whose names came afterward the praise and dread of war. Augereau, Massena, Serrurier, Joubert, Lannes, and Murat. All generals of the first consideration served under Bonaparte in the Italian campaign. The act of crossing the Alps and marching into Italy suited in every respect the ambitious and self-confident character of the general to whom it was now entrusted. It gave him a separate and independent authority, and the power of acting on his own judgment and responsibility. For his countryman, Cbteddy, the deputy who accompanied him as commissioner of the government, was not probably much disposed to intrude his opinions. He had been Bonaparte's patron, and was still his friend. The young general's mind was made up to the alternative of conquest or ruin, as may be judged by his words to a friend at taking leave of him. "In 3 months," he said, "I will be either at Milan or at Paris," intimating at once his desperate resolution to succeed, and his sense that the disappointment of all his prospects must be the consequence of a failure. With the same view of animating his followers to ambitious hopes, he addressed the army of Italy to the following purpose. "Soldiers, you are hungry and naked. The Republic owes you much, but she has not the means to acquit herself of her debts. The patience with which you support your hardships among these barren rocks is admirable, but it cannot procure you glory. I am come to lead you into the most fertile plains that the sun beholds. Rich provinces, opulent towns, all shall be at your disposal. Soldiers, with such a prospect before you, can you fail in courage and constancy?" This was showing the deer to the hound when the leash is about to be slipped. The Austro-Sardinian army, to which Bonaparte was opposed, was commanded by Beaulieu, an Austrian general of great experience and some talent, but no less than 75 years old, accustomed all his life to the ancient rules of tactics, and unlikely to suspect, anticipate, or frustrate those plans formed by a genius so fertile as that of Napoleon. Bonaparte's plan for entering Italy differed from that of former conquerors and invaders, who had approached that fine country by penetrating or surmounting at some point or other her alpine barriers. This inventive warrior resolved to attain the same object by turning round the southern extremity of the Alpine range, keeping as close as possible to the shores of the Mediterranean, and passing through the Genoese territory by the narrow pass called the Borchetta, leading around the extremity of the mountains betwixt these and the sea. Thus he proposed to penetrate into Italy by the lowest level which the surface of the country presented, which must be, of course, where the range of the Alps unites with that of the Apennines. The point of junction, where these two immense ranges of mountains touch upon each other, is at the heights of Mont Saint-Jacques, above Genoa, where the Alps, running northwestward, ascend to Mont Blanc, their highest peak, and the Apennines, running to the southeast, gradually elevate themselves to Monte Veleno, the tallest mountain of the range. To attain this object of turning the Alps in the manner proposed, it was necessary that Bonaparte should totally change the situation of his army. Those occupying a defensive line, running north and south, being to assume an offensive position extending east and west. Speaking of an army, as of a battalion, he was to form into column upon the right of the line which he had hitherto occupied, This was an extremely delicate operation to be undertaken in the presence of an active enemy, who was superior in numbers, nor was he permitted to execute it uninterrupted. No sooner did Beaulieu learn that the French general was concentrating his forces and about to change his position than he hastened to preserve Genoa, without possession of which, or at least of the adjacent territory, Bonaparte's scheme of advance could scarce have been accomplished. The Austrian divided his army into 3 bodies. Colli, at the head of a Sardinian division, he stationed at the extreme right at Chieva. His centre division, under D'Artagnan, having its head at Sarciello, had directions to march on a mountain called Montenotte, with 2 villages of the same name, near to which was a strong position at a place called Monteleghino, which the French had occupied in order to cover their flank during their march toward the east. At the head of his left wing, Beaulieu himself moved from Novy-upon-Voltri, a small town 9 miles west of Genoa, for the protection of that ancient city, whose independence and neutrality were like to be held in little reverence. Thus it appears that while the French were endeavouring to penetrate into Italy by an advance from Sardinia by the way of Genoa, their line of march was threatened by 3 armies of Austro-Sardinians descending from the skirts of the Alps and menacing to attack their flank. But, though a skilful disposition, Beaulieu's had, from the very mountainous character of the country, the great disadvantage of wanting connection between the 3 separate divisions. Neither, if needful, could they be easily united on any point desired, while the lower line, on which the French moved, permitted constant communication and cooperation. On April the 10th, 1796, D'Argento, with the central division of the Austro-Sardinian army, descended upon Montenotte, while Beaulieu, on the left, attacked the van of the French army, which had come as far as Voltri. General Savone, commanding the French division which sustained the attack of Beaulieu, was compelled to fall back upon the main body of his countrymen, and had the assault of D'Argento been equally animated, or equally successful, the flame of Bonaparte might have been stifled in its birth. But Colonel Rampont, a French officer who commanded the redoubts near Monteleghino, stopped the progress of D'Argento by the most determined resistance. At the head of not more than 1,500 men, whom he inspired with his own courage, and caused to swear to maintain their post or die there, he continued to defend the redoubts during the whole of the 11th, until D'Argento, whose conduct was afterwards greatly blamed for not making more determined efforts to carry them, drew off his forces for the evening, intending to renew the attack next morning. But on the morning of the 12th, the Austrian general found himself surrounded with enemies. Savoni, who retreated before Beaulieu, had united himself with La Harpe, and both advancing northward during the night of the 11th, established themselves in the rear of the redoubts of Monteleghino, which Rampont had so gallantly defended. This was not all. The divisions of Overthrow and Massena had marched by different routes on the flank and on the rear of D'Argento's column, so that next morning, instead of renewing his attack on the redoubts, the Austrian general was obliged to extricate himself by a disastrous retreat, leaving behind him colours and cannon, 1,000 slain, and 2,000 prisoners. Such was the Battle of Montenotte, the first of Bonaparte's victories, eminently displaying the truth and mathematical certainty of combination, which enabled him on many more memorable occasions, even when his forces were inferior in numbers and apparently disunited in position, suddenly to concentrate them and defeat his enemy, by overpowering him on the very point where he thought himself strongest. He had accumulated a superior force on the Austrian centre and destroyed it, while Colli on the right and Beaulieu himself on the left, each at the head of numerous forces, did not even hear of the action till it was fought and won. In consequence of the success at Montenotte and the close pursuit of the defeated Austrians, the French obtained possession of Cairo, which placed them on that side of the Alps which slopes towards Lombardy, where the streams from these mountains run to join the Po. Beaulieu had advanced to Voltri, while the French withdrew to unite themselves in the attack upon D'Argento. He had now to retreat northward with all haste to Dego, in the valley of the river Bomita, in order to resume communication with the right wing of his army, consisting chiefly of Sardinians, from which he was now nearly separated by the defeat of the centre. General Colli, by a corresponding movement on the left, occupied Millesimo, a small town about 9 miles from Dego, with which he resumed and maintained communication by a brigade stationed on the heights of Biastro. From the strength of this position, though his forces were scarcely sufficiently concentrated, Beaulieu hoped to maintain his ground till he should receive supplies from Lombardy, and recover the consequences of the defeat at Montenotte. But the antagonist whom he had in front had no purpose of permitting him such respite. Determined upon general attack on all points of the Austrian position, the French army advanced in 3 bodies upon a space of 4 leagues in extent. Augereau, at the head of the division which had not fought at Montenotte, advanced on the left against Millesimo. The centre, under Massena, directed themselves upon Dego, by the valley of the Bormida. The right wing, commanded by La Harpe, manoeuvred on the right of all, for the purpose of turning Beaulieu's left flank. Augereau was the first who came in contact with the enemy. He attacked General Colli, April the 13th. His troops, emulous of the honour acquired by their companions, behaved with great bravery, rushed upon the outposts of the Sardinian army at Millesimo, forced and retained possession of the gorge by which it was defended, and thus separated from the Sardinian army a body of about 2,000 men under the Austrian General Provera, who occupied a detached eminence called Cossaria, which covered the extreme left of General Colli's position. But the Austrian showed the most obstinate courage. Although surrounded by the enemy, he threw himself into the ruinous castle of Cossaria, which crowned the eminence, and showed a disposition to maintain the place to the last, the rather that, as he could see from the turrets of his stronghold, the Sardinian troops, from whom he had been separated, preparing to fight on the ensuing day, he might reasonably hope to be disengaged. Bonaparte in person came up, and seeing the necessity of dislodging the enemy from his strong post, ordered 3 successive attacks to be made on the castle. Joubert, at the head of one of the attacking columns, had actually, with 6 or 7 others, made his way into the outworks when he was struck down by a wound in the head. General Benal and Adjutant General Quenien fell each at the head of the column which he commanded, and Bonaparte was compelled to leave the obstinate Provera in possession of the castle for the night. The morning of the 14th brought a different scene. Contenting himself with blockading the castle of Cossaria, Bonaparte now gave battle to General Colli, who made every effort to relieve it. These attempts were all in vain. He was defeated and cut off from Beaulieu. He retired as well as he could upon Chèvres, leaving to his fate the brave General Provera, who was compelled to surrender at discretion. On the same day, Massena, with the centre, attacked the heights of Biastro, being the point of communication betwixt Beaulieu and Colli, while La Harpe, having crossed the Bormida, where the stream came up to the soldiers' middle, attacked in front and in flank the village of Dego, where the Austrian commander-in-chief was stationed. The first attack was completely successful. The heights of Biastro were carried, and the Piedmontese routed. The assault of Dego was not less so, although after a harder struggle. Beaulieu was compelled to retreat, and was entirely separated from the Sardinians, who had hitherto acted in combination with him. The defenders of Italy now retreated in different directions. Colli, moving westward toward Chèvres, while Beaulieu, closely pursued through a difficult country, retired upon Jddykst. Even the morning after the victory, it was nearly wrested out of the hands of the conquerors. A fresh division of Austrians, who had evacuated Voltri later than the others, and were approaching to form a junction with their general, found the enemy in possession of Beaulieu's position. They arrived at Dego like men who had been led astray, and were no doubt surprised at finding it in the hands of the French. Yet they did not hesitate to assume the offensive, and by a brisk attack drove out the enemy, and replaced the Austrian eagles in the village. Great alarm was occasioned by this sudden apparition, for no one among the French could conceive the meaning of an alarm beginning on the opposite quarter to that on which the enemy had retreated, and without it being announced from the outposts towards Jddykst. Bonaparte hastily marched on the village. The Austrians propelled 2 attacks. At the third, General Lenus, afterward killed in Egypt, put his hat upon the point of his sword, and advancing to the charge, penetrated into the place. Lannes also, afterward Duke of Montebello, distinguished himself on the same occasion by courage and military skill, and was recommended by Bonaparte to the Directory for promotion. In this Battle of Dego, more commonly called of Millesimo, the Austrian Sardinian army lost 5,000 or 6,000 men, 30 pieces of cannon, with a great quantity of baggage. Besides, the Austrians were divided from the Sardinians, and the two generals began to show not only that their forces were disunited, but that they themselves were acting upon separate motives. The Sardinians desiring to protect Turin, whereas the movements of Beaulieu seemed still directed to prevent the French from entering the Milanese territory. Leaving a sufficient force in the Bormida to keep in check Beaulieu, Bonaparte now turned his strength against Colli, who, overpowered and without hopes of succour, abandoned his line of defence near Ceva and retreated to the line of the Tanaro. Napoleon, in the meantime, fixed his headquarters at Ceva, and enjoyed from the heights of Montezumotto the splendid view of the fertile fields of Piedmont, stretching in boundless perspective beneath his feet, watered by the Po, the Tanaro, and 1,000 other streams which descended from the Alps. Before the eyes of the delighted army of victors lay this rich expanse like a promised land. Behind them was the wilderness they had passed, not indeed a desert of barren sand, similar to that in which the Israelites had wandered, but a huge tract of rocks and inaccessible mountains, crested with ice and snow, seeming by nature designed as the barrier and rampart of the blessed regions, which stretched eastward beneath them. We can sympathize with the self-congratulation of the general who had surmounted such tremendous obstacles in a way so unusual. He said to the officers around him, as they gazed upon this magnificent scene, "Hannibal took the Alps by storm. We have succeeded as well by turning their flank." The dispirited army of Colli was attacked at Mondovi during his retreat by 2 corps of Bonaparte's army from 2 different points, commanded by Messena and Serruria. The last general, the Sardinian, repulsed with loss, but when he found Messena in the meantime was turning the left of his line, and that he was thus pressed on both flanks, his situation became almost desperate. The cavalry of the Piedmontese made an effort to renew the combat. For a while they overpowered and drove back those of the French, and General Stengel, who commanded the latter, was slain in attempting to get them into order. But the desperate valour of Murat, unrivalled perhaps in the heady charge of cavalry combat, renewed the fortune of the field, and the horse as well as the infantry of Colli's army were compelled to a disastrous retreat. The defeat was decisive, and the Sardinians, after the loss of the best of their troops, their cannon, baggage, and appointments, and being now totally divided from their Austrian allies, and liable to be overpowered by the united forces of the French army, had no longer hopes of effectually covering Turin. Bonaparte, pursuing his victory, took possession of Cherasco, within 10 leagues of the Piedmontese capital. Thus fortune, in the course of a campaign of scarce a month, placed her favourite in full possession of the desired road to Italy, by command of the mountain passes which had been invaded and conquered with so much military skill. He had gained 3 battles over forces far superior to his own, inflicted on the enemy a loss of 25,000 men in killed, wounded, and prisoners, taken 80 pieces of cannon and 21 stands of colours, reduced to inaction the Austrian army, almost annihilated that of Sardinia, and stood in full communication with France upon the eastern side of the Alps, with Italy lying open before him as if to invite his invasion. But it was not even with such laurels, and with facilities which now presented themselves for the accomplishment of new and more important victories upon a larger scale, and with more magnificent results, that the career of Bonaparte's earliest campaign was to be closed. The head of the royal house of Savoy, if not one of the most powerful, still one of the most distinguished in Europe, was to have the melancholy experience that he had encountered with the man of destiny, as he was afterward proudly called, who for a time had power in the emphatic phrase of Scripture to bind kings with chains and nobles with fetters of iron. The shattered relics of the Sardinian army had fallen back, or rather fled, to within 2 leagues of Turin. without hope of being again able to make an effectual stand. The sovereign of Sardinia, Savoy, and Piedmont had no means of preserving his capital, nay, his existence on the continent, excepting by an almost total submission to the will of the victor. Let it be remembered that Victor Amadeus III was the descendant of a race of heroes, who, from the peculiar situation of their territories, as constituting a neutral ground of great strength betwixt France and the Italian possessions of Austria, had often been called on to play a part in the general affairs of Europe, of importance far superior to that which their condition as a second-rate power could otherwise have demanded. In general, they compensated their inferiority of force by an ability and gallantry which did them the highest credit, both as generals and as politicians. And now Piedmont was at the feet, in her turn, of an enemy weaker in numbers than her own. Besides the reflections on the past fame of his country, the present humiliating situation of the king was rendered more mortifying by the state of his family connections. Victor Amadeus was the father-in-law of Monsieur, by right Louis XVIII, and of the Comte d'Artois, the reigning king of France. He had received his sons-in-law at his court at Turin, had offered them an opportunity of assembling around them their forces, consisting of the emigrant noblesse, and had strained all the power he possessed, and in many instances successfully, to withstand both the artifices and the arms of the French republicans. And now, so born, so connected, and with such principles, he was condemned to sue for peace on any terms which might be dictated from a general of France aged 26 years, who a few months before was desirous of an appointment in the artillery service of the Grand Signor. An armistice was requested by the King of Sardinia under these afflicting circumstances, but could only be purchased by placing two of his strongest fortresses, those keys of the Alps, of which his ancestors had long been the keepers, Horne and Tortone, in the hands of the French, and thus acknowledging that he surrendered at discretion. The armistice was agreed on at Cherasco, but commissioners were sent by the king to Paris to arrange with the Directory the final terms of peace. These were such as victors give to the vanquished. Besides the fortresses already surrendered, the King of Sardinia was to place in the hands of the French 5 others of the first importance. The road from France to Italy was to be at all times open to the French armies, and indeed the king, by surrender of the places mentioned, had lost the power of interrupting their progress. He was to break off every species of alliance and connection with the combined powers at war with France, and become bound not to entertain at his court or in his service any French emigrants whatsoever, or any of their connections. Nor was an exception even made in favour of his own 2 daughters. In short, the surrender was absolute. Victor Amadeus exhibited the utmost reluctance to subscribe to this treaty, and did not long survive it. His son succeeded in name to the kingdom of Piedmont, but the fortresses and passes which had rendered him a prince of some importance were, excepting Turin and 1 or 2 of minor consequence, all surrendered into the hands of the French. Viewing this treaty with Sardinia as the close of the Piedmontese campaign, we pause to consider the character which Bonaparte displayed at that period. The talents as a general which he had exhibited were of the very first order. There was no disconnection in his objects. They were all attained by the very means he proposed, and the success was improved to the utmost. A different conduct usually characterizes those who stumble unexpectedly on victory, either by good fortune or by the valour of their troops. When the favourable opportunity occurs to such leaders, they are nearly as much embarrassed by it as by a defeat. But Bonaparte, who had foreseen the result of each operation by his sagacity, stood also prepared to make the most of the advantages which might be derived from it. His style in addressing the convention was, at this period, more modest and simple, and therefore more impressive than the figurative and bombastic style which he afterward used in his bulletins. His self-opinion, perhaps, was not risen so high as to permit him to use the sesquipedalian words and violent metaphors, to which he afterwards seems to have given a preference. We may remark also that the young victor was honourably anxious to secure for such officers as distinguished themselves the preferment which their services entitled them to. He urges the promotion of his brethren in arms in almost every one of his dispatches, a conduct not only just and generous, but also highly politic. Were his recommendations successful, their general had the gratitude due for the benefit. Were they overlooked, thanks equally belonged to him for his good wishes, and the resentment for the slight attached itself to the government, who did not give effect to them. End of section 35.
Section 36 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 14, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Overthrow of the Mamelukes, A.D. 1798, by Charles Knight. The Battle of the Nile. Napoleon's Italian victories forced even Austria to seek peace and acquiesce in the extension of the French Republic to the Rhine and over a considerable part of Italy. The continent was for a moment at peace, only England remaining in open hostility to France. A great invasion was planned to subdue the island kingdom, but Britain felt secure in the power of her ships, which had repeatedly defeated those of France, Spain, and Holland. The French government, which had gradually gathered a strong fleet on the Mediterranean, now at Bonaparte's urgency undertook what has often been regarded as the rather visionary attempt of conquering Egypt, perhaps expecting to extend French power all over Asia, and so destroy British trade, the source of Britain's wealth. Egypt was nominally subject to Turkey, but was really ruled by the Mamelukes, an aristocracy of soldiers who had held the land for centuries. Nelson, the English admiral, dispatched to discover and defeat the French fleet, is England's greatest naval hero. He had already won renown as second in command in an important victory over the Spaniards off Cape St. Vincent. The Battle of the Nile was the first of his three most celebrated achievements, the others being the defeat of the Danes at Copenhagen, and then the final destruction of the French and Spanish fleets at Trafalgar. Bonaparte, with great difficulty, persuaded the Directory to postpone their scheme for the invasion of the British Islands, and to permit him to embark an army for Egypt, the possession of which country he maintained would open to France the commerce of the East, and prepare the way for the conquest of India. Having subdued Egypt, he would return before another winter to plant the tricolour on the Tower of London. In April, Bonaparte was appointed General-in-Chief of the Army of the East. The secret had been well kept. The French fleet under Admiral Breze was in the harbour of Toulon, ready to sail upon its secret destination. Something different from the invasion of England was in the contemplation, for on board the admiral ship, L'Orient, were 100 literary men and artists, mathematicians and naturalists, who were certainly not required to enlighten the French upon the native productions or the antiquities of the British Isles. Bonaparte arrived at Toulon on May 9th and issued one of his grandiloquent proclamations to his troops. The armament consisted of 13 ships of the line, many frigates and corvettes, and 400 transports. The army, which it was to carry to some unknown shore, consisted of 40,000 men. On May 19th, this formidable expedition left the great French harbor of the Mediterranean. On the day when Bonaparte arrived at Toulon, Nelson had sailed from Gibraltar with 3 74s, 4 frigates, and a sloop to watch the movements of the enemy. Since the most daring of British naval commanders had fought in the Battle of St. Vincent, he had lost an arm in an unsuccessful attack upon the island of Tenerife. For some time his spirit was depressed, and he thought that a left-handed admiral could never again be useful. He had lost also his right eye and was severely wounded in his body, but he had not lost that indomitable spirit which rose superior to wounds and weakness of constitution. He rested some time at home, and then early in 1798 sailed in the vanguard to join the fleet under Lord St. Vincent. The Admiralty had suggested, and Lord St. Vincent had previously determined, that a detachment of the squadron blockading the Spanish fleet should sail to the Mediterranean under the command of Nelson. The seniors of the fleet were offended at this preference of a junior officer. and men of routine at home shrugged their shoulders and feared with the cold Lord Grenville that Nelson will do something too desperate. He was not stinted in his means, being finally reinforced with 10 of the best ships of St. Vincent's fleet. The first operation of Bonaparte was the seizure of Malta. His fleet was in sight of the island on June 9th. He had other weapons than his cannon for the reduction of a place deemed impregnable. The Order of St. John of Jerusalem had held the real sovereignty of the island since 1530. These Knights of Malta, powerful at sea, had formed one of the bulwarks of Christendom against the Ottomans. They had gradually lost their warlike prowess as well as their religious austerity, and Malta, protected by its fortifications, became the seat of luxury for this last of the monastic military orders whose occupation was gone. Bonaparte had confiscated their property in Italy, and he had sent a skillful agent to the island to sow dissensions among the knights, and thus to prepare the way for the fall of the community. There were so many French knights among them to whom the principal military commands had been entrusted by the Grand Master, a weak German. Bonaparte, on June 9th, sent a demand to the Grand Master that his whole fleet should be permitted to enter the great harbor for the purpose of taking in water. The reply was that, according to the rules of the order, only 2 ships, or at most 4, could be allowed to enter the port at one time. The answer was interpreted as equivalent to a declaration of hostility, and Bonaparte issued orders that the army should disembark the next morning on the coast of the island, wherever a landing could be effected. The island was taken almost without opposition, the French knights declaring that they would not fight against their countrymen. On June 13th, the French were put in possession of La Valletta and the surrounding forts. Bonaparte made all sorts of promises of compensation to the recreant knights, which the Directory were not very careful to keep. He landed to examine his prize when General Caffarelli, who accompanied him, said, "We are very lucky that there was somebody in the place to open the doors for us." Leaving a garrison to occupy the new possession, the French sailed away on the 20th with all the gold and silver of the treasury, and all the plate of the churches and religious houses. The essential point now, says Thiers, was not to encounter the English fleet. Nevertheless, he adds, nobody was afraid of the encounter. Nelson was at Naples on the day when Bonaparte quitted Malta. He immediately sailed. On the 22nd at night, the 2 fleets crossed each other's track unperceived between Cape Mesurado and the mouth of the Adriatic. The frigates of the British fleet had been separated from the main body, and thus Nelson had no certain intelligence. His sagacity made him conjecture that the destination of the armament was Egypt. He made the most direct course to Alexandria, which he reached on the 28th. No enemy was there, and no tidings could be obtained of them. On the morning of July 1st, Admiral Braise was off the same port and learned that Nelson had sailed away in search of him. Bonaparte demanded that he should be landed at some distance from Alexandria, for preparations appeared for the defense of the ancient city. As he and several thousand troops who followed him reached the shores in boats, a vessel appeared in sight, and the cry went forth that it was an English sail. "Fortune," he exclaimed, "dost thou abandon me? Give me only 5 days." A French frigate was the cause of the momentary alarm. Nelson had returned to Sicily. The Sultan was at peace with France. A French minister was at Constantinople. Such trifling formalities and the laws of nations were little respected by the man who told the soldiers that, the genius of liberty having rendered the Republic the arbiter of Europe, had assigned to her the same power over the seas and over the most distant nations. 4,000 of the French army were landed and marched in 3 columns to the attack of Alexandria. It was quickly taken by assault. Bonaparte announced that he came neither to ravage the country nor to question the authority of the Grand Signior, but to put down the domination of the Mamelukes, who tyrannized over the people by the authority of the Beys. He proclaimed to the population of Egypt in magnificent language that he caused to be translated into Arabic, that he came not to destroy their religion. "We Frenchmen are true Mussulmans. Have not we destroyed the Pope who called upon Europe to make war upon Mussulmans? Have not we destroyed the Knights of Malta because these madmen believed that God had called them to make war upon Mussulmans?" Leaving a garrison of 3,000 men in Alexandria, the main army commenced its march to Cairo. Bonaparte was anxious to arrive there before the periodical inundation of the Nile. The fleet of Brueys remained at anchor in the road of Aboukir. Bonaparte chose the shorter route to Cairo through the desert of Domanaur, leading 30,000 men, to each of whom he had promised to grant 7 acres of fertile land in the conquered territories, through plains of sand without a drop of water. They murmured and almost mutinied, but they endured, and at length reached the banks of the Nile, at Ramanaya, where a flotilla laden with provisions, baggage, and artillery awaited them. The Mamelukes, with Amurath Bey at their head, were around the French. The invaders had to fight with enemies who came upon them in detachments, gave a fierce assault, and then fled. As they approached the great pyramids of Giza, they found an enemy more formidable than those scattered bands. Amurath Bey was encamped with 12,000 Mamelukes and 8,000 mounted Bedouins on the west bank of the Nile and opposite Cairo. The French looked upon the great entrepot, where the soldiers expected to find the gorgeous palaces and the rich bazaars of which some had read in Gallen's Arabian Nights, whose tales they had recounted to their comrades on their dreary march under a burning sun. They had to sustain the attack of Amurath and his Mamelukes, who came upon them with the fury of a tempest. In the east, Bonaparte was ever in his altitudes. He now pointed to the pyramids and exclaimed to his soldiers, 40 centuries look down upon you. The chief attack of the Mamelukes was upon a square which Jddykst commanded. In spite of the desperate courage of this formidable cavalry, the steadiness of the disciplined soldiery of the army of Italy repelled every assault, and after a tremendous loss, Amurath Bey retreated toward Upper Egypt. His entrenched camp was forced amid a fearful carnage. The conquerors had no difficulty in obtaining possession of Cairo. Ibrahim Bey evacuated the city, which on July 25th Bonaparte entered. His new policy now was to conciliate the people instead of oppressing them. He addressed himself to the principal sheiks and obtained from them a declaration in favor of the French. It went forth with the same authority among the Mussulmans as a brief of the Pope addressed to Roman Catholics. In the Grand Mosque, a litany was sung to the glory of the favorite of victory, who at the head of the valiant of the West has destroyed the infantry and the horse of the Mamelukes. A few weeks later, the favorite of victory was seated in the Grand Mosque at the Feast of the Prophets, sitting cross-legged as he repeated the words of the Koran and edifying the sacred college by his piety. From the beginning to the end of July, Mr. Pitt was waiting with anxious expectation for news from the Mediterranean. During this suspense, he wrote to the speaker that he could not be quite sure of keeping any engagement he might make. It was not until September 26th that the English government knew the actual result of the toils and disappointments to which Nelson had been subjected. When it was known in England that he had been to Egypt and had returned to Sicily, the journalists talked of naval mismanagement, and worn-out captains who were hanging about the Admiralty asking for employment marveled at the rashness of Lord St. Vincent in sending so young a commander upon so great an enterprise. The Neapolitan ministry, dreading to offend the French Directory, refused Nelson the supplies of provision and water which he required before he again started in pursuit of the fleet which Caesar and his fortune bare at once. Sir William Hamilton was our minister at Naples. His wife was the favorite of the Queen of Naples, and one of the most attractive of the ladies of that luxurious court. Nelson had a slight acquaintance with Lady Hamilton, and upon his representations of the urgent necessity for victualling his fleet, secret instructions were given that he should be supplied with all he needed. In 1805, Nelson requested Mr. Rose to urge upon Mr. Pitt the claims of Lady Hamilton upon the national gratitude, because it was through her interposition, exclusively, he obtained provisions and water for the English ships at Syracuse in the summer of 1798, by which he was enabled to return to Egypt in quest of the enemy's fleet, to which, therefore, the success of his brilliant action of the Nile was owing, as he must otherwise have gone down to Gibraltar to refit, and the enemy would have escaped. On July 25th, Nelson sailed from Syracuse. It was 3 days before he gained any intelligence of the French fleet, and he then learned that they had been seen about 4 weeks before, steering to the southeast from Candia. He was again convinced that their destination was Egypt, and he made all sail for Alexandria. On August 1st, he beheld the tricolored flag flying upon its walls. His anxiety was at an end. For a week he had scarcely taken food or slept. The signal was made for the enemy's fleet, and he now ordered dinner to be served, and when his officers rose to prepare for battle, he exclaimed that before the morrow his fate would be a peerage or Westminster Abbey. The fleet of Admiral Bruyères was at anchor in the Bay of Aboukir. The transports and other small vessels were within the harbor. Bonaparte told O'Mara that he had sent an officer from Cairo with peremptory orders that Bruyères should enter the harbor, but that the officer was killed by the Arabs on the way. Bruyères had taken measures to ascertain the practicability of entering the harbor with his larger ships, and had found that the depth of the water was insufficient. He was unwilling to sail away to Corfu, as Bonaparte affirmed that he had ordered him to do if to enter the harbor were impracticable, until he knew that the army was securely established at Cairo. The French admiral moored his fleet in what he judged the best position, a position described by Nelson himself as a strong line of battle for defending the entrance of the bay of shoals, flanked by numerous gunboats, 4 frigates, and a battery of guns and mortars. The French ships were placed at a distance from each other of about 160 yards, with the van ship close to a shoal in the northwest, and the whole of the line just outside a 4-fathom sandbank, so that an enemy, it was considered, could not turn either flank. Nelson, with the rapidity of genius, at once grasped this plan of attack. Where there was room for a French ship to swing, there was room for an English ship to anchor. He would place half his ships on the inner side of the French line and half on the outer side. The number of ships in the two fleets was nearly equal, but 4 of the French were of a larger size. At 3 p.m. the British squadron was approaching the bay with a manifest intention of giving battle. Admiral Brueys had thought that the attack would be deferred to the next morning. Nelson had no intention of permitting the enemy to weigh anchor and get to sea in the darkness. By 6 o'clock, Nelson's line was formed without any precise regard to the succession of the vessels according to established forms. The shoal at the western extremity of the bay was rounded by 11 of the British squadron. The Goliath led the way, and when her commander Folly reached the enemy's van, he steered between the outermost ship and the shoal. The zealous Captain Hood instantly followed. At 20 minutes past 6, the 2 van ships of the French opened their fire upon these vessels, but they were soon disabled. 4 other British ships also took their stations inside the French line. Nelson in the vanguard, followed by 5 of his 74s, anchored on the outer side of the enemy. 9 of the French fleet were thus placed between the 2 fires of 11 of the British ships. The Leander had not been engaged, having been occupied in the endeavor to assist the Culloden, which, coming up after dark, ran aground. Before the sun went down, the shore was crowded with the people of the country gazing upon this terrible conflict. When darkness fell, the flashes of the guns faintly indicated the positions of the contending fleets. Each British ship was ordered to carry 4 lanterns at her mizzen peak, and these were lighted at 7 o'clock. Each ship also went into action with the white ensign of St. George, of which the red cross in the center rendered it easily distinguishable in the darkest night at sea. But there was another illumination more awful than the flashes of 2,000 cannon, which was that night to strike unwonted dismay into the bravest of the combatants of either nation. 5 of the French ships had surrendered. The vanguard had been engaged with the Spartier and the Aquilon. Her loss was severe. A splinter had struck Nelson on the head, cutting a large piece of the flesh and skin from the forehead, which fell over his remaining eye. He was carried down to the cockpit, and the effusion of blood being very great, his wound was held to be dangerous, if not mortal, by the anxious shipmates around him. He was carried where his men were also carried, without regard to rank, to be tended by the busy surgeons. These left their wounded to bestow their care on the first man of the fleet. "No," said Nelson, "I will take my turn with my brave fellows." Sidney, in the field of Zutphen, taking the cup of water from his lips to give to the dying soldier, with the memorable words, "This man's necessity is more than mine," was a parallel example of heroism. The admiral did wait his turn, and meanwhile, in the belief that his career was ended, called to his chaplain to deliver a last token of affection to his wife. The wound was found to be superficial. He was carried to his cabin and left alone amid the din of the battle. Suddenly the cry was heard that L'Orient, the French flagship of 120 guns, was on fire. Nelson groped his way to the deck to the astonishment of the crew, who heard their beloved commander giving his orders that the boats should be lowered to proceed to the help of the burning vessel. The Bellefontaine had been overpowered by the weight of metal of L'Orient, and had lost her masts. The Swiftsure had also been engaged with this formidable vessel. Both had maintained an unremitting fire upon the French flagship. Admiral Brueys had fallen, and had died the death of a brave man on his deck. The ship was in flames. At 10 o'clock she blew up, the conflagration having lasted for nearly an hour. When the explosion came, there was an awful silence. For 10 minutes not a gun was fired on either side. The instinct of self-preservation, as well as the sudden awe on this sublime event, produced this pause in the battle. Some of the French, endeavoring to get out of the vicinity of the burning wreck, had slipped their cables. The nearest of the English took every precaution to prevent the combustible materials doing them injury. The shock of the explosion shook the Alexander, Swiftsure, and Orion to their kelsons and materially injured them. None of the British ships, however, took fire. About 70 only of the crew of L'Orient were saved by the English boats. The battle was resumed by the French ship the Franklin, and it went on at intervals till daybreak. The contest was sustained by 4 French line of battleships and 4 of the English. Finally, 2 of the French line of battleships and 2 frigates escaped. Of 13 sail of the line, 9 were taken, 2 were burned. Of the British, about 900 men were killed and wounded. No accurate account was obtained of the French loss. The estimate, which represented that loss at 5,000, was evidently exaggerated. About 3,000 French prisoners were sent on shore. Kleber, the French general, wrote to Napoleon, "The English have had the disinterestedness to restore everything to their prisoners." After the victory of the Nile, Nelson returned to Naples. He required rest, and in the ease and luxury, the flattery and the honors which there awaited him, he forgot his quiet home, and after a time was involved in public acts which reflect discredit upon his previously spotless name. At Palermo, Lord Cochrane had opportunities of conversation with him. He says, to one of his frequent injunctions, "Never mind maneuvers, always go at them." I subsequently had to reason to consider myself indebted for successful attacks under apparently difficult circumstances. Cochrane considered Nelson an embodiment of dashing courage, which would not take much trouble to circumvent an enemy, but being confronted with one would regard victory so much a matter of course as hardly to deem the chance of defeat worth consideration. This opinion is borne out by a letter which Nelson wrote to his old friend Admiral Locker from Palermo. "It is you who always said, 'Lay a Frenchman close and you will beat him,' and my only merit in my profession is being a good scholar." Nelson was himself a master who made many good scholars. Monsieur Thiers, having described the great naval battle of Aboukir with tolerable fairness, admits that it was the most disastrous that the French navy had yet experienced, one from which the most fatal military consequences might be apprehended. The news of the disaster caused a momentary despair in the French army. Bonaparte received the intelligence with calmness. "Well," he exclaimed, "we must die here or go forth, great as were the ancients." He wrote to Kleber, "We must do great things," and Kleber replied, "Yes, we must do great things. I prepare my faculties." It would have been fortunate for the fame of Bonaparte if he had abstained from doing some of the great things which he accomplished while he remained in the East. The victory of Nelson formed the great subject of congratulation in the royal speech when the session was opened on November 20th. By this great and brilliant victory, an enterprise of which the injustice, partify, and extravagance had fixed the attention of the world, and was peculiarly directed against some of the most valuable interests of the British Empire, has, in the first instance, been turned to the confusion of its authors. End of section 36.
Section 37 of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 14. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Availle in May 2024. The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 14, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd. Section 37. Jenner introduces vaccination. A.D. 1798. By Sir Thomas J. Pettigrew. In the advance of medical science, no more famous discovery has been made than that of vaccination, that is, inoculation with the modified virus of a disease, thereby causing a mild form of it in order to prevent a virulent attack. This treatment has in recent years been applied by the use of various serums and antitoxins against different diseases. But originally and specifically, vaccination, as now understood, is inoculation with cowpox for the prevention of smallpox. Jenner's work in connection with the modern introduction of this practice is fully described in the following pages. In a more primitive manner, inoculation against smallpox was practiced many centuries ago in India, China, and other lands. The first modern accounts of it are said to have been given by a Turkish physician in 1714. In England, it was first actually employed through the efforts of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who, 1716 to 1718, had observed it in Constantinople, and there seen her son inoculated. The practice soon spread through Western Europe and North America. Jenner's discoveries and demonstrations as to the specific value of the vaccine virus of cowpox, which led to the modern methods of vaccination for prevention of smallpox, proved of such efficacy and importance that the whole credit for this service to medical science has been popularly given to him. But among the intelligent, it detracts nothing from his just fame to make due acknowledgment of previous work along similar lines. There have always been some, since Jenner's time, and are still, considerable numbers of people in different countries, strongly opposed to vaccination for smallpox, on the ground of what they deem its unscientific and dangerous nature. But the vast majority of medical practitioners, and of the world at large, are convinced of its vital benefits, and in several countries vaccination is made compulsory by the state. Edward Jenner was born on May 17, 1749. He was a native of Berkeley in Gloucestershire, England. His father was the vicar of this place, and his mother was descended from an ancient family in Berkshire. In early life, Jenner was deprived of his father, and the direction of his education devolved upon an elder brother, the Reverend Stephen Jenner. He attained a respectable proficiency in the classics, and his taste for natural history manifested an early development, for, at the age of 9, he had made a collection of the nests of the dormouse, and he employed the hours usually devoted by boys to play in searching for fossils in the neighborhood. No childish play to him was pleasing. Intended for the medical profession, Jenner was apprenticed to Daniel Ludlow of Sodbury near Bristol to acquire a knowledge of surgery and pharmacy, and after the period of his apprenticeship had expired in 1770, he went to London to complete his professional studies, and was a student at St. George's Hospital, and a resident for 2 years in the family of the celebrated John Hunter. The similarity of their tastes and spirit of research will render it a matter of no surprise that he should become a most favourite pupil. That this was the case in an eminent degree, the correspondence which was maintained between the two great physiologists sufficiently proves. There was in both a directness and plainness of conduct, an unquestionable desire of knowledge, and a congenial love of truth. Jenner was remarkable for the neatness and precision with which he made preparations of anatomy and natural history. His dissection of tender and delicate organs, his success in minute injections, and the taste he displayed in their arrangement are said to have been almost unrivalled. Hunter recommended him to Sir Joseph Banks to prepare and arrange the various specimens brought home by the celebrated circumnavigator Captain Cook in his first voyage of discovery in 1771, and he was solicited to become the naturalist of the succeeding expedition in the year following. But Jenner's partiality to his native soil, and his desire of settling in the place of his birth, were too strong to admit of his being allured into such an appointment. He preferred the seclusion of a country village, and to this seclusion do we owe one of the greatest blessings ever bestowed upon mankind. It is not unreasonable to suppose that the subject by which he should afterward be known to the whole world dwelt upon his mind with considerable force even at this early period, for the prophylactic powers of the cowpox were known, or rather rumoured of, in a few districts, and the subject had been mentioned by Jenner to Hunter and others, though he had not been successful in directing their attention sufficiently to the importance of it. Indeed, he pressed this subject so much upon his professional brethren that, at a medical club at Redborough to which he belonged, he was threatened to be expelled if he persisted in harassing them with a proposition which they then conceived had no foundation but in popular and idle rumour, and which had become so entirely distasteful to them. It remained, therefore, to Jenner to pursue the inquiry, and to place the whole matter upon a proper physiological basis, by which it might be rendered permanently beneficial. This inquiry was perfected amid the labours and anxious toils attendant on the life of a country surgeon, with few books to consult, and little leisure to devote to their perusal. Observation necessarily supplied the place of literary research. The book of nature was open to his view, and it was one he was well calculated to comprehend. It surpassed all others, and its contemplation amply repaid the student. Of all classes of men with whom it has been the fortune of the writer of this sketch to associate, there is none, in his opinion, so generally and so truly amiable as the naturalists. The contemplation of nature seldom fails to produce an elevation of character. It also begets a sweetness of disposition flowing from a sense of what is beautiful in creation, and the evidences of beneficence, everywhere so abundant, soften the feelings and impart to the individual a sincere benevolence of heart. This disposition was strikingly manifested in Jenner, to whose affection, kindness, meekness, goodwill, and benevolence so many have borne the most ample testimony. It was no uncommon thing for Jenner to be accompanied in his daily professional tour of many miles by friends who have eagerly listened to the outpourings of his mind called forth by the beauties which in the vale of Gloucester surrounded him. His observations on the structure and economy of the various objects of natural history were delivered with the most captivating simplicity and ingenuity. Full of information himself, he delighted to impart it, and was equally solicitous of obtaining a return from others. He was an enthusiast in his devotion to nature, and he anxiously desired that all should participate in the gratification which such a study never failed to afford. He united in an especial manner a talent for the most profound observations to a disposition most lively and ardent, distinguished by mirth, playfulness, and wit. With these powers, it is not surprising that his society could have been much courted, and, fully engaged as he was by the duties of an extensive practice, he yet found time to cultivate an acquaintance with polite literature. Many little productions of his muse have appeared in print. They were addressed to some of his more favoured correspondents, or occasionally read at convivial meetings, and displayed the turn of his mind, the benevolence of his disposition, and the liveliness of his imagination. His best poetical productions find their subjects in natural history. The Signs of Rain unites the accuracy of the naturalist with the fancy of the poet. Jenner had nearly passed half a century before he made known to the world his experiments and investigations relative to the vaccine disease. His first successful vaccination was made May 14, 1769. His ardour from an early period had been noticed, and it took its rise from the following accidental circumstance. While a pupil with Mr. Ludlow, a young countrywoman applied for advice. The subject of smallpox was mentioned, upon which she observed, "I cannot take that disease, for I have had the cowpox." This was sufficient to excite the attention of Jenner, and the incident never escaped his recollection. It is easier to conceive than to express the emotions which would naturally spring from reflection on such a subject. His benevolent feelings were at once aroused to full activity. He pictured to himself all the horrors of that pestilential and most loathsome disease, disfiguring nature's greatest work, slaying thousands upon thousands, and he was yet sufficiently young to recollect the severity of discipline to which he had himself submitted in the process preparatory to the practice of inoculation, which, to use his own words, in that day was no less than that of bleeding till the blood was thin, purging till the body was wasted to a skeleton, and starving on a vegetable diet to keep it so. The patience manifested by Jenner in the prosecution of his inquiry into the cowpox, the scrutiny to which he subjected every appearance that presented itself, and the fortitude with which he withstood every untoward circumstance, entitle him to all praise, and show forth his great capabilities for conducting a philosophical investigation. He divested the subject of all its difficulties and obscurities, and gave to vague, inapplicable, and useless rumour the certainty and precision of scientific knowledge. The extent of his anticipations upon this truly momentous subject do not appear to have been fully stated until 1780, 10 years subsequent to his mention of it to John Hunter. He then confidentially disclosed to his intimate friend Edward Gardner, who gave evidence upon the subject before the Committee of the House of Commons, the opinions he entertained upon the natural history of the cowpox, dated its origin from the diseased heel of a horse, alluded to the different diseases with which the hands of the milkers became affected from handling the infected cows, distinguished that which was calculated to afford security against the smallpox, and divulged the hope he entertained of being able finally to eradicate that disease from the face of the globe. Dr. Barron has recorded the remarkable words with which this important communication was made. Quote, "I have entrusted a most important matter to you, which I firmly believe will prove of essential benefit to the human race. I know you, and should not wish that I have stated to be brought into conversation, for should anything untoward turn up in my experiments, I should be made, particularly by my medical brethren, the subject of ridicule, for I am the mark they all shoot at." End quote. Jenner's reasons for concealment did not arise from any selfish or unworthy motive. The publicity he had always given to the subject and the efforts he had made among his professional associates to pursue the inquiry exclude the possibility of entertaining such a suspicion. It arose from a dread of disappointment and the fear of failure, should the matter be brought forward in a state other than that of a maturity sufficient to carry conviction immediately upon its promulgation. In the course of his researches, he was led to conclude that swine-pox, as well as cow-pox, was only a variety of smallpox. He inoculated his eldest son with the matter of swine-pox and produced a disease similar to a very mild smallpox. After this, the inoculation of variolous matter would produce no effect. He ascertained that cowpox, as it was commonly termed by the milkers, would frequently fail in effecting a security against the smallpox. This led him to inquire more particularly into the variety of spontaneous eruptions to which the teats of the cow were liable, and to discriminate the different kinds of sores produced by them on the hands of the milkers, and to establish the character of those which possessed a specific power over the constitution, and those which had no such efficacy. He found that instances occurred in which the true cowpox failed in preventing smallpox, but, nothing daunted by this apparently fatal discovery, he set about ascertaining the causes of this deviation. He found the specific virtues of the virus to have been lost or deteriorated, so that it was rendered capable only of producing a local affection, and had no influence whatever upon the constitution. And by the greatest ingenuity and patience of observation of the analogies drawn from the virus of smallpox, aided by his knowledge of the laws of the animal economy, he discovered that it was only in a certain state of the vesicle that the virus was capable of affording its protecting agency, and that, when taken under other conditions or at other periods, it could produce a local disease, yet that it was not able to manifest any constitutional effect or afford immunity from the invasions of the smallpox. On May 14, 1796, Jenner inserted lymph taken from the hand of Sarah Nelms, who was infected with cowpox, into the arm of James Phipps, a healthy boy of about 8 years of age. This is the first instance of regular inoculation of the vaccine disease by Jenner. The boy went through the disorder, and on July 1st following he had the matter of smallpox introduced into his arm, but no effect followed. Jenner had not before seen the cowpox but as presented on the hands of the milkers, nor had it been transmitted from one human being to another. He was struck with its great resemblance to the smallpox pustule. The success of this case must necessarily have operated powerfully upon him, and have urged him to continue the research with increased energy. His anticipations thus realized, his intentions accomplished, what must have been the feelings of such a man as Jenner? They were suited to the magnitude of the occasion, and marked the character of the philosopher, distinguished as it ever was by great simplicity, benevolence, and humility. While, says he, the vaccine discovery was progressive, the joy I felt at the prospect before me of being the instrument destined to take away from the world one of its greatest calamities, blended with the fond hope of enjoying independence and domestic peace and happiness, was often so excessive that in pursuing my favorite subject among the meadows I have sometimes found myself in a kind of reverie. It is pleasant to me to recollect that these reflections always ended in devout acknowledgments to that Being from whom this and all other mercies flow. Lord Bacon said that it is heaven upon earth to have a man's mind move in charity, rest in providence, and turn upon the poles of truth. Jenner was a striking illustration of the truth of that remark. The modesty of Jenner was evidenced in his original intention of submitting his observations on the cowpox in a paper addressed to the Royal Society. Dr. Barron tells us that, when the subject was laid before the President, the late Sir Joseph Banks, Jenner was given to understand that he should be cautious and prudent, that he had already gained some credit by his communications to the Royal Society, and ought not to risk his reputation by presenting to the learned body anything which appeared so much at variance with established knowledge, and withal so incredible. It came forth most unostentatiously about the end of June 1798, dedicated to his friend Dr. Perry of Bath. Dr. Jenner visited London in the month of April of that year, and remained until July 14th. His object in this visit was to demonstrate the disease to his professional friends, but such was the distrust, or apathy, felt on the occasion, that Jenner returned to the country without having been able to prevail on a single individual to submit to the inoculation of the virus. The virus Jenner brought to London was consigned to the care of the late Mr. Klein of St. Thomas's Hospital. This celebrated surgeon inserted some of it, by 2 punctures, into the hip of a young patient with a disease of that part of the body. This calescent mode of proceeding was adopted with the idea of exciting a counter-irritation in the diseased part. The intention was to convert the vesicles into an issue after the progress of the cowpox had been observed. This idea was, however, abandoned. Smallpox matter was afterward inserted into this child in 3 places. It produced a slight inflammation on the 3rd day, and then subsided. The child was effectually protected against the disease. Mr. Klein now became very sanguine as to the result, and inoculated 3 other children with lymph taken from the vesicles of the child, but no evil effect ensued. The subject began to excite the attention of the profession, and all were eager to put the matter to the test of experiment. Mr. Klein urged Dr. Jenner to settle in London. He promised him £10,000 a year as the result of his practice. What was his reply? Quote, "Shall I, who even in the morning of my days sought the lowly and sequestered paths of life, the valley, and not the mountain, shall I, now my evening is fast approaching, hold myself up as an object for fortune and for fame? Admitting it as a certainty that I obtain both, what stock should I add to my little fund of happiness? My fortune, with what flows in from my profession, is sufficient to gratify my wishes. Indeed, so limited is my ambition, and that of my nearest connections, that even were I precluded from future practice, I should be enabled to satisfy all my wants. As for fame, what is it? A gilded butt, forever pierced with the arrows of malignancy." End quote. That a discovery of such importance to mankind, once divulged, should bring forth many claimants, and that its author should be subjected to virulent attacks, is easy to be conceived. Jenner, however, never thought it necessary to reply to unfounded and harsh aspersions, satisfied in the strength of his own case, and feeling the justice and truth of his own claims and position. The practice being now established, it is unnecessary even to refer to the names of the opponents of vaccination. Many mistakes, and some of a serious nature, occurred to interrupt the progress of the discovery. These had been for the most part foreseen by Jenner, and were satisfactorily explained. In a letter to a friend, Jenner said, "I will just drop a hint. The vaccine disease, in my opinion, is not a preventive of the smallpox, but the smallpox itself. That is to say, the horrible form under which the disease appears in its contagious stage is, as I conceive, a malignant variety. Again, what I have said on this vaccine subject is true. If properly conducted, it secures the constitution as much as variolous inoculation possibly can. It is the smallpox in a purer form than that which has been current among us for 12 centuries past. And, in a letter to Mr. Pruen, I have ever considered the variola and the vaccine radically and essentially the same. As the inoculation of the former has been known to fail in instances so numerous, it would be very extraordinary if the latter should always be exempt from failure. It would tend to invalidate my early doctrine on this point. It is not necessary here to dwell upon the fatality of the smallpox when taken in the natural way, or to show that the mortality has been increased by the practice of inoculation, which creates an atmosphere for the constant propagation of the disease. These have been satisfactorily demonstrated in evidence before the House of Commons, and anyone may readily obtain this information. It is, however, interesting to record the names of those who, abandoning all prejudice and solicitous to promote a general good, submitted to the practice at its earliest period. Mr. Henry Hicks was the first to submit his own children to the vaccination. Lady Frances Morton, Lady Ducie, was the first personage of rank who had her child, and her only child, vaccinated. The Countess of Berkeley was instrumental in forwarding it, and the children of King William IV were vaccinated by Mr. Knight. Jenner's discovery entailed upon him a most extensive correspondence, and obliged him frequently to travel in London. His professional engagements were not only interrupted, but almost annihilated, and his private fortune encroached upon by such circumstances. His friend urged an application to Parliament. A petition to Parliament was presented on March 17, 1802, and Mr. Addington, later Lord Sidmouth, informed the House that he had taken the King's pleasure on the contents of the petition, and that His Majesty recommended it strongly to the consideration of Parliament. A committee was appointed, of which Admiral Berkeley was the chairman. A great mass of evidence was brought forward, and many professional and other persons examined. The Duke of Clarence gave his testimony, and manifested strongly his conviction of the prophylactic powers of the vaccine disease. Much opposition was offered to the claims of Jenner. He felt this deeply, and in a letter to his friend Mr. Hicks, dated April 28, 1802, he writes, "I sometimes wish this business had never been brought forward. It makes me feel indignant to reflect that one who has, through a most painful and laborious investigation, brought to light a subject that will add to the happiness of every human being in the world, should appear among his countrymen as a supplicant for the means of obtaining a few comforts for himself and family." The committee reported, and the House voted £10,000 to Dr. Jenner. An amendment proposing £20,000 was lost by a majority of 3. Sir Gilbert Blaine, Dr. Lettsom, and others, feeling the utter inadequacy of this reward to the merits of the case, proposed to raise a fund by public subscription, but it was not carried into effect. The Royal Jennerian Society was established in 1803, and had the King for the patron, the Queen for the patroness, and various members of the royal family and nobility for its supporters. The design of the institution was to vaccinate the poor gratuitously, and supply virus to all parts of the world. It effected great good, and reduced the number of deaths by smallpox in a very remarkable degree. But dissensions sprang up, chiefly to the conduct of the resident inoculator recommending practices contrary to the printed regulations of the Society, and it was virtually dissolved in 1806. Lord Henry Petty, later Marquis of Lansdowne, was the Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1806, and on July 2nd brought the subject of vaccination again before the House of Parliament. Upon this, the College of Physicians was directed to make inquiry into its state and condition, and a report was made on April 19, 1807. The report was highly satisfactory as to the advantages of the practice. On July 29th, the Right Honourable Spencer Perceval, being then Chancellor of Exchequer, called the attention of the House to it, and moved an additional grant of £10,000, when an amendment to double the sum was proposed by Mr. Edward Morris, MP for Newport, in Cornwall, and carried by a majority of 13. In 1808, the National Vaccine Establishment was formed, where the practice of vaccination and the supply of lymph has ever been continued. Foreign academies and societies enrolled Dr. Jenner in the lists of their associates, and the medical societies of his own country were not less anxious to adorn their roster with his name. In 1808 he was elected a corresponding member of the National Institute, and in 1811 was chosen an associate, in place of Dr. Mackelein, deceased. The Empress Dowager of Russia sent him a diamond ring, accompanied by a letter in testimony of her admiration of vaccination. She had the first child vaccinated in Russia named Vaksinov, and fixed a pension upon it for life. The Medical Society of London presented him with a gold medal. The Physical Society of Guy's Hospital instituted a new order of members under the title of Honorary Associates, and named Jenner for the first. The nobility and gentry of Gloucestershire presented him with a handsome gold cup, and various other marks of consideration were bestowed upon him as testimonies to the benefits he had conferred upon mankind. He was chosen mayor of his native town, received the freedom of the Corporation of Dublin, the freedom of the city of Edinburgh, and elected an honorary fellow of the Royal College of Physicians of that city. In 1813, the University of Oxford granted him a degree of Doctor in Physic by a decree of the Convocation. The diploma was presented him by Sir Cbteddy and Dr. Kidd, the professors of anatomy and chemistry. On this occasion, and a similar honour had not been conferred by the University on any man for nearly 70 years before, Dr. Jenner observed, "It is remarkable that I should have been the only one of a long line of ancestors and relations who was not educated at Oxford. They were determined to turn me into the meadows instead of allowing me to flourish in the groves of Academus. It is better, perhaps, as it is, especially as I have arrived at your highest honours without complying with your ordinary rules of discipline." The conduct of the London College of Physicians, it is painful to remark, was not characterized by such liberality. The majority of the fellows refused to admit him without the usual examination. Many of the fellows were anxious upon the subject, but their wishes did not prevail. The Commander-in-Chief of the Army, upon the recommendation of the Army Medical Board and the Lords of the Admiralty, recommended the adoption of vaccination in the Army and Navy, and the naval physicians and surgeons presented a gold medal to Jenner for his discovery. The practice extended itself through France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Russia, and the United States. In the East it overcame even the scruples of the Hindu and the Chinese. The writer of this memoir, by the kindness of Sir George Staunton, is in possession of a treatise on vaccination drawn up by Mr. Pearson and translated by Sir George into the Chinese language. It was of great use in encouraging the natives to the adoption of the salutary practice. The King of Prussia submitted his own children to vaccination. He was the first monarch to do so. On September 13, 1815, Dr. Jenner lost his wife. He retired to Berkeley and thereafter lived in retirement. He died January 26, 1823, in the 74th year of his age, and was buried on February 3rd in the chancel of the parish church of Berkeley. End of section 37. End of The Great Events by Famous Historians, Volume 14, edited by Charles F. Horne, Rossiter Johnson, and John Rudd.